The Kwantung Army was once the most feared instrument of Imperial Japan's will, a million-strong force that acted as the absolute masters of Manchuria. But in the humid, rain-soaked darkness of August 1945, that reputation was a hollow shell, and the men manning the border fortifications were guarding a graveyard of their own making. They believed the Soviet Union, exhausted by 4 bloody years of war against Nazi Germany, had neither the strength nor the desire to open a second front in the Far East. The Japanese generals were convinced that the impassable terrain of the Greater Khingan Mountains and the soaking summer rains provided a natural fortress that no army could breach. They were wrong. For months, under the cover of darkness and strict radio silence, the Red Army had moved a force of terrible magnitude to the border, bringing with them a weapon that would redefine the sound of terror. In this war, battles were won not just by bullets, but by logistics and the ruthless application of industrial superiority. Now, let us return to the dark, rain-swept border of Manchuria. The border between the Soviet Union and Japanese-occupied Manchuria stretched for thousands of miles, a jagged line separating two ancient empires that had stared each other down for decades. To the Japanese sentries peering out from their concrete pillboxes on the night of August 8, 1945, the landscape appeared empty. The summer rains had turned the ground into a churning sea of mud, a quagmire that Japanese intelligence officers guaranteed was impassable for heavy armor or artillery. Inside the warm, dimly lit bunkers, officers of the Kwantung Army reviewed their maps with a dangerous complacency. They knew the Soviet Union had renounced the Neutrality Pact in April, but their strategic estimates placed any potential invasion months away, likely in the autumn when the ground hardened. They relied on the logic of conventional warfare, assuming the Soviets would need months to transfer their forces from Berlin to Vladivostok. What the Japanese commanders did not see, hidden beneath the canopy of the taiga and the shroud of the storm, was the greatest logistical feat of the Second World War. The Soviet High Command, Stavka, had not rested after the fall of Berlin. Instead, they had executed a massive, covert transfer of forces that defied imagination. Over 1.5 million men, thousands of tanks, and tens of thousands of artillery pieces had traveled along the Trans-Siberian Railway, moving east as the German prisoners moved west. Among this armada of steel were the veterans of Stalingrad, Kursk, and the Silo Heights, men who had learned the art of war in the hardest school on earth. And with them came the machines that had pulverized the Wehrmacht. Hidden in the tree lines, mere miles from the unsuspecting Japanese lines, sat rows of American-made Studebaker trucks. These were not transport vehicles. Bolted to their chassis were racks of steel rails, angled upward toward the dark sky. These were the BM-13 Katyushas, the mobile rocket launchers that had earned a grim reputation on the Eastern Front. Unlike traditional artillery, which required heavy recoil mechanisms and long setup times, the Katyusha was crude, simple, and terrifyingly effective. It was a weapon designed not for precision, but for saturation. The crews manning these trucks wiped the rain from the guide rails and checked the fuses on the 132mm rockets. They worked in silence, strictly forbidden from lighting fires or speaking above a whisper. The element of surprise was their most potent ammunition. The confidence of the Kwantung Army was rooted in a bygone era. In 1939, at the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, the Soviets had given the Japanese a bloody nose, but the lesson had been interpreted selectively by Tokyo. The Japanese believed that while the Soviets were strong, they were clumsy and reliant on heavy supply lines that could be disrupted. The Japanese defenses in 1945 were designed to channel an attacker into kill zones, relying on static fortifications and the sheer fighting spirit of the imperial soldier. However, the army that manned these walls was not the elite force of 1941. The best divisions had been siphoned off to fight the Americans in the Pacific, leaving behind a force composed largely of raw conscripts, reservists, and second-rate equipment. They were an army on paper, formidable in numbers but lacking the heavy anti-tank weaponry and modern communications needed to stop a mechanized juggernaut. General Otozo Yamada, commander of the Kwantung Army, slept soundly in his headquarters in Shinking, hundreds of miles from the front. His intelligence reports indicated no immediate threat. The deception plan, or maskirovka, employed by the Soviets had been total. They had moved entire armies at night, covered tracks with branches, and maintained normal radio traffic patterns elsewhere to simulate inactivity. The Japanese focused their attention on the obvious invasion routes, leaving the difficult terrain of the mountains lightly defended. They could not conceive that Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, the Soviet commander, intended to drive his tank armies over mountains that were considered insurmountable even for pack animals. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the rain intensified, drumming against the helmets of the Soviet infantrymen waiting in their assembly areas. The order had been passed down the line. There would be no preliminary artillery bombardment in some sectors, a tactic chosen to maximize shock. In others, the god of war would clear the path. The rocket crews adjusted the elevation of their launch rails one last time. The rockets, looking like simple metal pipes with fins, sat heavy and cold in their cradles. Each truck carried 16 of these projectiles. When fired in battery, hundreds of rockets could be delivered in seconds, blanketing an area in fire and shrapnel. The Japanese sentries on the far side of the Amur River and along the fortified zones shivered in the damp air. They smoked their cigarettes, shielding the embers from the rain, and spoke of home, of the rumors of a new bomb dropped on Hiroshima, and of the eventual end of the war. They did not know that the end was already upon them. The silence that hung over the border was not peace. It was the deep inhalation before a scream. The indifference of nature, the sound of the wind and the rain, masked the mechanical growl of thousands of engines turning over in the distance. The bear had arrived in the east, and its claws were sharpened steel. The dichotomy was absolute. On one side, an army blinded by arrogance and stripped of its veterans, huddled in concrete boxes, trusting in the mud to save them. On the other, a juggernaut of modern mechanized warfare, coiled and ready to spring, possessing a weapon that did not just kill, but shattered the nerves of anyone who heard its song. The BM-13 crews stood by their firing lanyards. The officers checked their watches, the second hands sweeping toward the top of the hour. It was August 9th, 0 hour. The time for secrets was over. The time for the Katyusha had arrived. The signal came not as a shout, but as a cascade of flares cutting through the gloom, or in some sectors, simply the synchronized drop of a commander's hand, as the second hand on a synchronized watch crossed the vertical. At that precise instant, The suffocating silence of the Manchurian frontier was annihilated. The wet darkness, previously broken only by the flickering light of a sentry's cigarette or a distant lightning strike, was suddenly illuminated by a man-made sunrise of terrifying intensity. On the Soviet side of the line, the effect was physical. As the firing circuits closed, the solid fuel propellant in thousands of rocket motors ignited simultaneously. The ground beneath the Studebaker trucks shuddered violently. These were not the refined, recoil-dampened convulsions of heavy howitzers. This was a raw, shaking violence that threatened to tear the suspension from the chassis. The trucks rocked on their springs, their front wheels lifting momentarily from the mud as the rails above them erupted. One by one, in rapid ripples of less than half a second, the 132mm rockets tore themselves free from the guide rails. For the Soviet crews, the experience was an assault on the senses. The backblast kicked up a storm of steam, mud, and debris, instantly blinding the rear windshields. The heat was intense enough to sear the paint on the launch rails and boil the rain that slicked the metal. But it was the sound that defined the moment. It was not the deep, rhythmic boom of cannons that veterans of the First World War would have recognized. It was a high-pitched, grinding shriek, a mechanical wail that sounded like 1,000 heavy chains being dragged across a metal deck at high speed. This was the noise that had earned the weapon its reputation on the Eastern Front, a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated in the teeth and bones of anyone standing near. The sky above the border filled with streaks of fire. From a distance, it looked as if the earth itself had opened up to vomit molten iron into the clouds. The rockets climbed into the blackness, their exhaust trails painting angry, bright lines against the storm. They did not fly in the neat, singular arcs of artillery shells. They flew in swarms, hunting in packs, wobbling slightly as they fought against the wind and the rain, converging on grid coordinates that had been mapped out by reconnaissance teams weeks prior. On the Japanese side, the reaction was delayed by the physics of sound and distance. For a few seconds, the sentries saw only the sudden, inexplicable flashes on the horizon, like a thunderstorm gone wrong. They stood in their trenches and pillboxes, squinting into the rain, trying to process the visual anomaly. Then the sound arrived. It washed over the Japanese lines like a physical wave, a rising, terrifying crescendo that drowned out the rain and the wind. It was a noise that defied their training. The Imperial Japanese Army was disciplined, drilled in the sounds of mortars, grenades, and howitzers. But they had no frame of reference for this. It sounded as though the sky was being torn apart by giant hands. Panic, primal and immediate, gripped the frontline troops. Men who had been sleeping moments before were thrown from their bunks by the sheer acoustic pressure. In the pillboxes, officers shouted orders that went unheard, their voices lost in the overwhelming roar. They scrambled for their Type 92 heavy machine guns, instinctively trying to target an enemy they could not see, but there was nothing to shoot at. The enemy was the sky itself. Then came the impact. When a conventional artillery battery fires, the shells arrive in a rhythm. Boom, pause, boom. A soldier might dive for cover between the impacts. But the Katyusha did not offer that mercy. The rockets arrived all at once. An entire battery could dump hundreds of kilograms of high explosives onto a target area in under 10 seconds. The result was not a series of explosions, but but a single, continuous event of destruction. The earth along the Japanese defensive line erupted. The impact zone became a churning grinder of fire and shrapnel. The rockets were not designed to penetrate deep concrete like heavy siege guns. They were designed to shred everything on the surface. The fragmentation shrapnel scythed through the air, cutting down barbed wire entanglements, detonating landmines, and shredding the camouflage netting that hid the bunkers. The heat of the explosions turned the rain into scalding steam, creating a fog of war that was hot, choking, and impenetrable. Inside the trenches, the psychological effect was devastating. The ground heaved and rolled like the deck of a ship in a typhoon. Dust and pulverized concrete filled the air, coating the lungs of the soldiers who huddled in the bottoms of their foxholes, hands pressed over their ears, screaming prayers that could not be heard. The communication lines, the nervous system of the Kwantung Army, were severed in the first seconds. Telephone wires that had been painstakingly laid and buried were ripped from the ground or snapped by the concussive force. The command posts went dead. The officers, blinded and deafened, were cut off from their superiors and their subordinates. The impassable fortified zones, the pride of the Japanese engineers, were being dismantled not by precision strikes, but by brute force. A concrete pillbox might survive a direct hit, but the men inside were concussed, bleeding from the nose and ears, their morale shattered by the sheer intensity of the barrage. They had expected a battle of maneuver, a test of wills. Instead, they were being subjected to an industrial execution. As the last rockets of the first salvo detonated, a strange, ringing silence rushed back in to fill the void, broken only by the crackle of burning timber and the cries of the wounded. The air smelled of cordite, ozone, and wet earth. The Japanese survivors, dazed and trembling, peeked over the parapets of their ruined trenches, expecting to see infantry charging. But the night was still dark. The Soviets were not done. Back in the taiga, the reload crews were already hefting fresh rockets onto the smoking rails. The terror had only just begun. The midnight thunder was not a storm that would pass. It was the herald of an annihilation that would continue until the very will to fight was extinguished. The Germans had called it Stalin's organ, a grim reference to the visual resemblance of the rocket tubes to the pipes of a church organ and the lethal music it played. To the Japanese soldiers in Manchuria, who were encountering this weapon for the first time, the nickname was unknown, but the sentiment was understood instantly in the marrow of their bones. The BM-13 was not a weapon of finesse. It was a triumph of crude, effective engineering over the intricate, over-engineered designs often favored by the Axis powers. At its heart, the Katyusha was deceptively simple. The launcher consisted of parallel I-beam rails mounted on a simple tubular frame. It lacked the complex recoil hydraulics, rifled barrels, and heavy breech blocks of a standard howitzer. This simplicity was its genius. It could be manufactured in tractor factories by unskilled labor. It could be mounted on almost anything: tanks, tractors, and, most famously, the rugged American Studebaker US-6 trucks provided via Lend-Lease. These trucks gave the weapon extraordinary mobility, allowing Soviet commanders to shoot and scoot, unleashing a barrage and relocating before the enemy could triangulate their position for counter-battery fire. But the true horror lay in the projectile itself. The M-13 rocket, was a 132mm steel cylinder filled with high explosives. Unlike an artillery shell, which spins rapidly due to the rifling in the barrel to maintain accuracy, the M13 was fin-stabilized. It was inherently less accurate than a gun. In a conventional duel, a howitzer could put a shell through a window at 5 miles. A Katyusha might miss the building entirely. But the Soviets understood that in modern war, accuracy was secondary to volume. Who needs to hit a window when you can level the entire city block? The defining characteristic of the weapon, the sound, was a byproduct of its propulsion. The solid fuel propellant burned rapidly, forcing gas out of nozzles at the rear to generate thrust. Because the rockets were fired from open rails rather than a closed barrel, the noise was not contained. It screamed. This acoustic signature was unique. A soldier on the receiving end heard a sound that increased in pitch as the rocket approached, a phenomenon known as the Doppler effect, but amplified to a deafening degree. It sounded like a tearing of the fabric of reality. For the Japanese troops, this auditory assault broke men's minds before the shrapnel even touched them. Human evolution has programmed the brain to react to certain sounds with fear, the roar of a predator, the hiss of a snake. The Katyusha tapped into that primal circuitry. It created a sense of helplessness. When a shell whistles, you have a split second to react. When the air itself is screaming from every direction, there is nowhere to run. As the second and third salvos began to fall on the Manchurian border defenses, the flaws in the Japanese defensive doctrine became fatally apparent. Their bunkers were designed to withstand flat trajectory fire from tanks or the plunging fire of mortars. They were not designed to withstand a saturation bombardment that arrived at supersonic speeds and detonated on contact. The fuses on the Katyusha rockets were often set to super quick, meaning they exploded the instant they touched the ground or an obstacle. This maximized the spread of shrapnel, turning the rocky terrain of Manchuria into lethal buckshot. The Japanese artillery attempted to respond, but they were fighting a ghost. Their spotters, peering through periscopes in the driving rain, looked for the telltale muzzle flashes of cannon fire. Instead, they saw vast clouds of smoke and dust rising from different locations every few minutes. By the time the Japanese 105mm and 150mm guns had calculated a firing solution and sent rounds down range, the Studebakers were gone, their crews already driving to a new firing point a mile away. It was a game of cat and mouse where the cat was blind and the mouse was a tiger. Inside the impact zones, the devastation was total. The sheer quantity of explosives created overpressure waves that could kill a man without leaving a mark on his body. Soldiers sheltering in open trenches were found dead, with their lungs collapsed by the blast wave. The heat was so intense, it ignited the surrounding vegetation despite the heavy rain. Fires began to burn in the undergrowth, casting a hellish, flickering light over the battlefield. The Japanese officers, trained in the samurai code of Bushido, found their leadership crumbling. How do you order a man to charge when the ground is exploding? How do you maintain discipline when the noise is so loud that commands cannot be heard? The spiritual power that the Imperial Army relied upon, the belief that Japanese spirit could overcome material superiority, was being tested against the laws of physics, and physics was winning. The BM-13 was the embodiment of the Soviet war machine, ugly, mass-produced, and ruthlessly effective. It did not care about the elegance of war. It did not care about the honor of single combat. It was an industrial eraser designed to wipe opposition off the map. As the night wore on, the screaming did not stop. It became the rhythm of the invasion, a relentless, grinding soundtrack to the collapse of an empire. The Japanese soldiers, huddled in the mud, realized with dawning horror that this was not a battle they could fight. It was a natural disaster they could only hope to survive. The organ was playing its tune, and the song was death. The defensive lines of the Kwantung Army had been constructed with the meticulous, obsessive detail characteristic of Japanese military engineering. They were a network of interlocking fire zones, reinforced concrete machine gun nests, and deep, zigzagging trenches designed to minimize damage from conventional shelling. But as the Katyusha barrage continued into the early hours of the morning, the geometry of these defenses was erased. The rockets did not respect the logic of the trench. They rained down vertically, turning the zigzag patterns, meant to stop shock waves traveling laterally, into traps where men were pinned down by a ceiling of fire. The chaos began at the perimeter. The Japanese had laid miles of barbed wire, staked low to the ground to trip advancing infantry. It was a formidable barrier that would have taken combat engineers hours to cut through under fire. The rocket barrage vaporized it. The super-quick fuses of the M-13 projectiles detonated on the wire itself or the ground immediately beneath it. The blast waves snapped the iron stakes like dry twigs and turned the coiled wire into thousands of high-velocity shrapnel whips. In mere minutes, the iron hedge that was supposed to channel the Soviet advance was gone, replaced by a smoking, cratered wasteland that offered no resistance to the tanks waiting in the darkness. Further back, in the command bunkers, the situation deteriorated from confusion to absolute paralysis. The Japanese command structure relied heavily on rigid hierarchy and constant communication. A lieutenant would not retreat without orders from a captain. A captain would not alter the defensive plan without approval from a major. But the telephone lines were dead. Runners sent out into the storm to deliver messages simply vanished, swallowed by the explosions or cut down by the flying debris. Battalion commanders found themselves shouting into dead handsets, demanding status reports from companies that no longer existed. The isolation was terrifying. Each pillbox, each trench section, became a lonely island in a sea of fire. The soldiers inside knew only what they could see through their narrow firing slits, which was nothing but flashes of light and plumes of mud. They did not know if the unit on their left flank was holding or if they had been overrun. They did not know if the screaming noise was the prelude to an infantry assault or if it was simply the end of the world. In this vacuum of information, rumors spread like a virus. Some men believed the Americans had joined the attack. Others thought a new type of volcanic weapon was being used. The disciplined cohesion of the Imperial Army began to fray. The physical destruction of the fortifications was systematic. The concrete pillboxes, built to withstand the direct impact of a 75mm shell, were subjected to a different kind of stress. The constant rapid-fire concussions of the rockets created a jackhammer effect. The earth around the bunkers was churned away, exposing the foundations. The concrete itself began to spall and crack under the relentless vibration. Inside, the air became unbreathable. The ventilation systems were clogged with dust, and the accumulation of carbon monoxide from the explosions and the firing of their own weapons made the soldiers dizzy and nauseous. In the forward trenches, the infantry faced a grim reality. The rain had turned the bottom of the trenches into a slurry of mud and water, now mixed with the ash and chemical residue of the explosives. Men slipped and fell, their rifles jamming with the muck. When a rocket landed directly in a trench segment, the result was catastrophic. The confined space channeled the blast wave, liquefying organs and shattering bones even for those who were not hit by shrapnel. The survivors were left stunned, their uniforms shredded, trying to dig their comrades out of the collapsed earth walls with their bare hands. The vaunted Type 92 heavy machine guns, the woodpeckers that had terrorized Allied troops in the Pacific, sat silent. Their crews were ready, their fingers on the triggers, but they were impotent. The Katyushas were firing from miles away, well beyond the range of any machine gun. The Japanese gunners were fighting an enemy they could not reach, an enemy that was systematically dismantling their world without ever showing its face. The frustration was palpable. Samurai swords, symbols of authority and honor carried by the officers, vibrated in their scabbards with every explosion. As the barrage shifted its focus, walking back from the front lines to the support trenches, it caught the reserve units in the open. These men had been rushing forward to reinforce the perimeter, moving through the communication trenches or across open ground. They were caught in the open, exposed and vulnerable. The rockets caught them in mid-stride. There was no cover to be found. The terrain itself, the hills and ravines of the border region, offered no shelter from a rain that fell from the zenith. By the time the sun began to hint at rising behind the storm clouds, the Japanese defensive line had effectively ceased to function as a cohesive system. It was no longer a wall. It was a series of disconnected, burning ruins. The surviving officers looked out over a landscape that had been transformed. Landmarks were gone. Trees were reduced to splintered stumps. The geography of the battlefield had been rewritten by high explosives. The soldiers who crawled out of the debris were deaf, covered in gray dust, and trembling uncontrollably. They clutched their rifles, but their eyes were empty. They had prepared to fight men. They had not prepared to fight the apocalypse. The screaming of the trucks had stopped for the moment, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying, for it was the silence of the grave. And in the distance, the low, mechanical rumble of diesel engines began to grow louder. The steel wave was coming. The Japanese High Command had gambled the fate of Manchuria on a single geological certainty. The Greater Khingan Mountains were impenetrable. Rising like a spinal column through the region, these peaks reached heights of over 5,000 feet, covered in dense primeval forests and surrounded by treacherous swamps. In the strategic calculus of the Kwantung Army, this terrain was a fortress built by nature itself. They believed that no modern mechanized army could traverse these slopes, certainly not with the speed required to catch the defenders off guard. They calculated that any Soviet advance would be confined to the few improved roads and railway lines, creating predictable bottlenecks where Japanese anti-tank guns could wait in ambush. They were prepared for a war of choke points. They were not prepared for the Soviet ability to weaponize logistics. As the smoke from the initial Katyusha barrages began to drift through the valleys, the Red Army launched an offensive that treated geography not as a limit but as a challenge to be crushed. The vanguard of this assault was a strange, hybrid beast of American industry and Soviet determination. The Studebaker US-6 trucks, the very platforms that carried the terrifying rocket launchers, now faced their greatest test. These were rugged machines, six-wheel drive workhorses supplied under Lend-Lease, but they were being asked to do the impossible. They were tasked with climbing 30-degree slopes of rain-slicked mud, hauling tons of explosives and steel rails through forests where no roads existed. The advance did not look like a parade. It looked like a struggle against the earth itself. The summer rains had turned the few mountain tracks into rivers of slurry. The roads marked on maps dissolved into quagmires the moment the first tank treads tore into them. But the Soviet column did not stop. When the lead vehicles bogged down, sinking to their axles in the black muck, the army simply physically lifted them out. Thousands of infantrymen, stripped to their undershirts in the humid air, marched alongside the trucks. They carried logs, stones, and bundles of brushwood. When a wheel spun uselessly in the mud, these men threw down a corduroy road, a temporary surface of timber laid perpendicular to the path. They built the road as they drove over it, mile by agonizing mile. The drivers of the Katyusha trucks fought the steering wheels with bruised hands, their boots stomping on the pedals, coaxing the engines to pull the heavy launchers up the inclines. The engines roared in protest, overheating in the humid air, steam hissing from the radiators to mix with the mountain mist. But behind every truck was a T-34 tank or a tractor, ready to attach a tow cable and winch the rocket launcher up the steepest grades. It was a symphony of mechanical exertion. The forest echoed with the grinding of gears, the snapping of branches, and the shouts of sergeants coordinating the movement of thousands of tons of metal. This was the deep battle doctrine of the Soviet Union realized in its most extreme form. Marshal Vasilevsky had ordered that the advance continue day and night, regardless of weather, regardless of fatigue. There was no sleep. Drivers dozed for minutes at a time, while engineers cleared fallen trees from the path. They ate dry rations in the cabs of their trucks. The momentum was the only thing that mattered. If they stopped, the mud would claim them. If they kept moving, they would achieve the impossible. For the Japanese spotters stationed on the lower peaks, the sight that emerged from the morning mist was a hallucination. They looked down into the valleys where only deer and tigers were supposed to roam, and saw a river of steel flowing uphill. The Katyushas were not left behind at the railheads as the Japanese had predicted. They were right there, keeping pace with the lead tanks. The psychological impact of this logistical miracle was profound. The Japanese defensive plans were predicated on the assumption that heavy artillery would take weeks to position. Yet here were the screaming trucks, cresting the ridges and deploying their stabilizers on the high ground, ready to fire down into the unprotected rear areas of the Japanese lines. The Soviet engineers performed feats that bordered on the miraculous. In sectors where the slopes were too steep for engines, they used block and tackle systems rigged to ancient pine trees to hoist the vehicles up the cliffs. In the swamps, they laid down kilometers of prefabricated wooden track. They bypassed the Japanese demolition charges on the few existing bridges by simply driving through the riverbeds. The water rose to the floorboards of the Studebakers, threatening to flood the engines, but the waterproofed electrical systems held. The trucks emerged from the rivers like amphibious monsters, dripping slime, and continued the relentless march west. This relentless pace shattered the Japanese decision-making loop. By the time a Japanese commander received a report that a Soviet column had been sighted in the mountains, that column was already 20 miles past the sighting, descending into the plains. The fortress of the Greater Khingan had become a sieve. The natural barriers had failed because the Soviets brought an industrial solution to a geographical problem. As the column reached the summits of the mountain range, the weather began to break. The clouds parted, revealing the vast, green expanse of the Manchurian plain stretching out before them. To the tired, mud-caked crews of the rocket trucks, it looked like victory. To the Japanese forces stationed in the cities below, who looked up to see the silhouettes of rocket launchers lining the ridge lines, it looked like the end. The Soviets had done more than just move an army. They had moved the front line to the enemy's doorstep before the enemy had even put on their boots. The impossible advance was complete. Now, gravity was on their side. The trucks shifted into high gear, rolling downhill, their rails loaded and pointed at the heart of the Kwantung Army. The nightmare that had started at the border was coming to the cities. As the Soviet armored columns poured down from the mountain passes and fanned out across the Manchurian plains, the local Japanese commanders faced a desperate calculus. The static defensive lines had been breached, the communication networks were in tatters, and the enemy was moving with a speed that defied the rigid timetables of the Imperial General Headquarters. There was only one option left in the tactical manual of the Kwantung Army: the counterattack. If they could not hold the line, they would break the enemy's momentum with a display of sheer aggressive spirit. They would hurl themselves at the invaders and force a battle of close-quarters savagery where their presumed moral superiority would outweigh the material disadvantage. From the concealed assembly areas in the tall kaoliang grass and the millet fields, the remnants of the Japanese armored divisions began to move. These were the Type 97 Chiha and the lighter Type 95 Hago tanks. In the 1930s, against the poorly equipped Chinese armies, these vehicles had been kings of the battlefield. But in 1945, against the veterans of the Eastern Front, they were tragic anachronisms. Their armor was thin enough to be pierced by heavy machine guns. Their main cannons were low-velocity pop guns compared to the high-velocity killers mounted on the Soviet T-34s and IS-2s. Yet the Japanese crews revved their diesel engines, tied their hachimaki headbands tight, and lurched forward into the mud, intent on dying for the emperor. Accompanying these steel coffins were the infantry, the human bullets. Lacking effective anti-tank rockets like the American bazooka or the German Panzerfaust, the Japanese resorted to the terrifying lunge mine, the Shitotsubakurai. This was a hollow charge warhead mounted on the end of a bamboo pole. The tactic was suicide by design. A soldier was expected to rush a Soviet tank, ram the mine against its hull, and detonate it, killing himself instantly in the hope of disabling the machine. It was a tactic born of desperation, a weaponization of the human soul. The Soviet commanders, watching from their turret hatches and forward observation posts, did not panic. They had fought the Wehrmacht's Panther and Tiger tanks. They were not intimidated by the riveting hulled antiques rattling toward them. They simply picked up their radios and called for the organs. The response was immediate. The BM-13 batteries, deployed just behind the leading tank spearheads, adjusted their elevation. This time, they were not firing at distant coordinates on a map. They were firing over open sights or at ranges so short that the rockets barely had time to arc. The air filled once again with that soul-crushing scream. The result was not a battle. It was a massacre. The Japanese counterattack ran headlong into a wall of high explosives that descended with the density of a monsoon rain. The Katyushas did not need to score direct hits on the light Japanese tanks to destroy them. The shock waves from the 132mm rockets flipped the 7-ton Type 95s over like toys. The concussions ruptured fuel tanks and detonated ammunition racks, turning the Japanese armor into burning pyres before they could even bring their guns to bear. For the infantry sprinting alongside the tanks, the lunge mines proved to be a curse. As the rockets saturated the ground, the shock waves triggered the sensitive fuses of the suicide mines held in the soldiers' hands. Squads of men were vaporized by their own weapons, chain reacting in the middle of the field. The tall grass, which had provided concealment, caught fire, trapping the attackers in a burning maze. Those few Japanese tanks that managed to survive the initial rocket barrage and close the distance found themselves facing the heavy armor of the Soviet vanguard. The 57mm shells of the Chiha tanks struck the sloped armor of the T-34s and simply bounced off, leaving sparks but no damage. In return, the Soviet tanks fired their 85mm cannons, tearing the Japanese vehicles apart. But the true stopper of the assault remained the relentless area saturation of the rocket trucks. The Katyushas stripped the Japanese tanks of their infantry support. A tank without infantry is blind and vulnerable, but the Japanese infantry could not advance through the curtain of fire the BM-13s had laid down. The human bullet tactic relied on the enemy being surprised or hesitant. But the Red Army was a machine of industrialized violence. When a Japanese soldier rose from the grass with a lunge mine, he was met not just by rifle fire, but by the suppressing fire of entire rocket batteries. The ground was churned so thoroughly that the terrain became difficult to traverse. The Japanese charge lost its cohesion. Officers waved their swords, screaming for the men to advance, only to be silenced by the shrieking arrival of another salvo. It was a clash of eras. On one side was the Bushido Code, the belief that spirit could conquer matter, that the will of the warrior was the ultimate weapon. On the other side was the cold, hard math of total war, represented by the unthinking, unfeeling rocket. The rocket did not care about the bravery of the man it killed. It did not respect his sacrifice. It simply erased him. As the sun climbed higher, the counterattack faltered and died. The fields were littered with the smoking hulks of the Type 97s and the shattered remains of the suicide squads. The expected glorious death had been denied to them. They had been annihilated by an enemy they could barely see, by a weapon that killed indiscriminately and massively. The Soviet columns did not stop to celebrate or even to secure the area. They simply drove over the wreckage, their treads crushing the debris into the mud, continuing their drive toward the cities of Harbin and Mukden. The futile resistance of the border guards had bought no time. It had only proved that in the face of modern logistical firepower, courage alone was no longer a currency that could buy victory. The screaming trucks moved up, their rails smoking, ready to sing their song to the next line of defense. The physical destruction of the Kwantung Army was horrific, but the psychological dismantling of its soldiers was a phenomenon unto itself. In the annals of warfare, few weapons have possessed the singular ability to erode the human will as effectively as the BM-13. By the third day of the offensive, the sound of the rockets had become a psychological pathogen, infecting the minds of men who had been raised to regard surrender as the ultimate disgrace. For the Japanese soldier, sleep became a memory. The Soviet doctrine of continuous operations meant that the barrage did not respect the cycles of day and night. The darkness, usually a time for rest or covert movement, was now the most terrifying time of all. The sudden illumination of the horizon, followed by that rising, grinding shriek, triggered a Pavlovian response of pure dread. Medical officers in the rear areas, overwhelmed by casualties with no visible wounds, began to document a catastrophic collapse in morale. Men arrived at aid stations trembling violently, unable to hold a cup of water, their eyes wide and unseeing. They were not cowards. They were biological organisms whose nervous systems had been overloaded by acoustic violence. The terror lay in the randomness. A sniper is personal, an artillery shell is mathematical. But the Katyusha was chaotic. The rockets landed in wide, unpredictable patterns, turning entire grid squares into death zones. A soldier in a foxhole knew that skill, rank, and experience meant nothing. The rockets did not care if he was a raw recruit or a decorated veteran of the China campaign. This realization stripped away the soldier's agency. It created a fatalistic lethargy, where men simply sat in the bottom of their trenches, smoking their last cigarettes, waiting for the inevitable flash that would end their existence. Inside the command bunkers, the breakdown of discipline began to manifest in subtle, corrosive ways. The rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Army relied on the projection of confidence by the officer class. But how could an officer project confidence when he could not hear his own voice? The constant concussions disrupted the inner ear, causing vertigo and nausea. Commanders found themselves shouting contradictory orders, their judgment clouded by sleeplessness and the incessant pounding. The spirit of the warrior, the Yamato Damashi, was a powerful concept in hand-to-hand combat. But it offered no protection against a barrage that could vaporize a command post from 5 miles away. Rumors filled the vacuum left by severed communication lines. In the absence of orders from Shinking, the soldiers invented their own nightmares. They whispered that the Soviets had developed a weapon that burned the air, suffocating men before they were hit. They spoke of land torpedoes that burrowed underground. The scream of the rockets was interpreted as the sound of demons, a supernatural judgment upon an empire that was losing the mandate of heaven. The rational mind tried to find a framework for the devastation, and failing that, it retreated into superstition and despair. The sheer scale of the Soviet logistics also played a crucial role in breaking the Japanese spirit. The Japanese soldiers were accustomed to rationing their ammunition, to making every shot count. They watched in disbelief as the Soviets fired rockets with an indifference to cost that seemed infinite. The ground was carpeted with steel. To the starving, undersupplied Japanese conscript, this display of industrial abundance was a message. We have more metal than you have flesh. It forced a confrontation with the reality of Japan's material poverty. They realized they were not fighting an army. They were fighting the entire industrial output of a superpower. This psychological pressure cooker forced a change in the tactical behavior of the Japanese units. Where they had once fought to the last man, isolated garrisons began to waver. The banzai charges of the first days grew fewer, not just because of the casualties, but because the emotional energy required to launch them had been drained. A man can charge a machine gun. He can charge a tank, but he cannot charge a sound. He cannot charge the sky. The enemy remained faceless, a distant mechanic pulling a lever on a truck, while the Japanese soldier died in the mud, humiliated by his own helplessness. The officers, bound by the code that demanded suicide over surrender, found themselves in a moral crisis. To order their men to die against such overwhelming firepower felt less like a military necessity and more like a crime. The logic of sacrifice required a purpose, to buy time, to inflict damage. But the Katyushas denied them even that. They were being wiped out before they could engage. In the deep recesses of the bunkers, amidst the dust falling from the cracked ceilings, the unthinkable thought began to take root. This war is over. It was a quiet, internal crumbling. It happened in the pauses between the barrages, when the ringing in the ears subsided enough to hear the groans of the wounded. It happened when a soldier looked at his rifle, a bolt-action Arasaka designed in 1905, and then looked at the crater where his squad used to be. The scream of the Katyusha had done what years of propaganda and island-hopping campaigns had struggled to do. It had proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the Imperial way had led them to a dead end. The silence of the gods was deafening, replaced by the mechanical scream of the rocket trucks. The spirit was not just broken, it was pulverized, leaving behind only the hollow shell of an army waiting for the final blow to fall. By the time Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over the radio waves on August 15th, broadcasting the capitulation of Japan, the Kwantung Army had already ceased to exist as a functional military entity. The Jewel voice broadcast was merely the formal punctuation mark on a sentence that had been written in steel and fire by the Soviet advance. In many sectors of the front, the fighting did not stop immediately. Communications were so thoroughly destroyed by the rocket barrages that isolated Japanese garrisons fought on for days, unaware that their empire had fallen. They fought until the last box of ammunition was empty, or until the organs were brought forward to silence them for good. When the surrender finally took hold across the vastness of Manchuria, it resulted in one of the most surreal spectacles of the Second World War. The once proud soldiers of the Imperial Army, men who had been indoctrinated to believe they were the divine guardians of Asia, emerged from the ruins of their fortifications. They did not march out in formation. They stumbled out. They were covered in the gray dust of pulverized concrete, their uniforms hanging loosely on emaciated frames. They piled their rifles, their helmets, and their ancestral swords into massive heaps that grew into rusting mountains of metal. The Soviet columns rolled into the major cities of Harbin, Mukden, and Sinking, not as conquerors entering a battlefield, but as wardens entering a prison. Leading these parades were the T-34 tanks, their hulls scarred but unbroken. And right behind them, driving slowly through the wide boulevards, were the Studebaker trucks with the launch rails angled toward the sky. The Chinese civilians, who had lived under the brutal occupation of the Japanese for 14 years, watched in awe. They saw the Japanese soldiers, who had once walked these streets with terrified arrogance, now cowering at the sight of the dirty olive-drab trucks. The weapon had become a totem of authority. Its mere presence was enough to quell any thought of resistance. The logistics of the surrender were staggering. Over 600,000 Japanese soldiers were taken prisoner. As they were herded into vast holding columns for the long, brutal march to the Siberian labor camps, they walked past the artillery parks of the Red Army. There, they saw them up close for the first time, the BM-13s. Parked in silent rows, the launchers looked deceptively simple, just rails on a truck. There was no intricate machinery, no polishing, no gold inlay. It was a utilitarian death machine. For many of the Japanese officers, this was the final humiliation. They had been defeated not by a superior warrior spirit, but by a mass-produced assembly of girders and solid fuel. The silence that fell over Manchuria in late August was heavy and unnatural. The screaming had stopped. The birds began to return to the forests that hadn't been burned. But for the survivors, the silence was not peaceful. It was ringing. The auditory trauma of the Katyusha barrage lingered long after the smoke cleared. In the years that followed, veterans of the Kwantung Army would wake in the night, gripping their bedsheets, convinced they heard that grinding mechanical shriek rising in the distance. The sound had branded itself into their subconscious. It was the sound of the modern world arriving to crush the old. A reminder that in the face of total industrial war, there was no place for tradition, only for firepower. The swiftness of the collapse stunned the world. Military analysts in Washington and London had predicted the Soviets would need months to subdue the Kwantung Army. They did it in less than 2 weeks. The Katyusha had played a pivotal role in this acceleration. It had acted as a battering ram that smashed the doors of the fortresses, allowing the tanks to flood through. It had proven that a well-supplied mobile army, equipped with overwhelming saturation fire, could bypass or destroy the strongest static defenses. As the long columns of prisoners disappeared into the northern horizon, vanishing into the Soviet Gulag system, they left behind a changed map. The vacuum they left was filled by the forces that would shape the next half-century of conflict in Asia. But in those final days of August 1945, the political ramifications were secondary to the visceral reality of the battlefield. The invincible Kwantung Army had been broken. It had been broken by speed, by mud, by T-34s. But most of all, it had been broken by the terrifying song of the Stalin's organ. The trucks turned their engines off. The rails cooled in the autumn air. The war was over, but the echo of the scream would resonate forever. The collapse of the Kwantung Army was more than just a military defeat. It was the violent collision of 2 centuries. The Japanese Imperial Army, with its samurai ethos and spiritual rigidity, crashed against the unyielding wall of mid-20th century industrial warfare. The BM-13 Katyusha was the avatar of this new age. It was not honorable, it was not precise, and it was not subtle. It was a weapon of pure, overwhelming efficacy that converted logistics into destruction on a scale previously unimagined. The terror those Japanese soldiers felt in the rain-soaked trenches of Manchuria was the terror of obsolescence. They realized in the deafening roar of the rockets that courage alone could no longer hold back the tide of history. The scream of the Katyusha served as the final bell for the old world, signaling the arrival of a superpower that would define the decades to come. The silence that followed was bought at a terrible price, paved with the wreckage of an empire and the shattered minds of the men who stood in its way. And that is why these tales must be told.